watch this. Jane Wicker sitting on top of the world. Oh no!
28 disasters, 7 levels. I spent hours scouring the internet and collected the worst stunt disasters into this iceberg. We'll start with the heart-stopping near misses and go deeper into fatal errors that'll make you swear off adrenaline forever. So let's start at the tip of this iceberg. Level 1. In 1989, a bird strike at 500 feet turned a masterclass of aviation into a 15-ton fireball, leaving the pilot with a split-second choice: save himself or the crowd. Anatoly Kavochur was a titan of Soviet aviation, and this Paris airshow stunt was something he'd practiced dozens of times, a low-speed, high-angle pass in his MiG-29. But just as he was about to begin the stunt, disaster struck. A bird got sucked into his right engine. Losing one engine would have been fine had he not slowed down for the maneuver, because at low speeds, losing half your power isn't just a mechanical failure, it's a death sentence. Thus, the jet turned violently and pitched its nose directly toward the massive crowd of spectators. Kavochur had less than 2 seconds to act, 2 seconds to choose his own life or a massacre. But where most pilots would have panicked, he kept his composure, fighting the controls and steering the fighter away from the crowd. People thought that they were about to witness the death of Anatoly Kavochur, but just as the plane reached a vertical dive, he pulled a handle. The pilot was shot out horizontally as the MiG slammed into the ground and burst into flames. His parachute didn't even have time to deploy before he hit the dirt. But despite everything, he walked away from the crash with only minor bruising. A rally driver's slight misjudgment turned the world record attempt for the longest car jump ever into something no one expected. Gerland Schitteri was behind the wheel of a modified Mini Countryman in the French Alps in 2014, and the goal was something no human had ever achieved: a 360-foot jump. The world watched in silence as Schitteri took off in his rally car. They thought it was perfect. The speed, the angle, everything. But the driver knew something was wrong as soon as he hit the air. Months of preparation, and he'd failed to consider one crucial factor: physics. The Mini was far too front-heavy for a jump this long and tipped forward as soon as it left the ramp. The rally driver was no longer flying, he was plummeting. Seconds felt like hours as he careened towards the landing ramp. And the thing that really added insult to injury was that he was gonna reach it, just not on his wheels. Everyone watched in horror as the car slammed nose first into the landing ramp, the impact instantly destroying the vehicle. But that wasn't even the worst part, because after the impact, the car kept tumbling down the mountain until it finally stopped on its roof. The wreckage looked grim, it looked unsurvivable. But as the rescue crews reached the mangled frame, they found Schitteri alive. The reinforced cage had absorbed the force of a crash that should have been fatal. Schitteri was airlifted to the hospital with only a shoulder injury, and even though he missed the record, he lived to fight another day. Most people would be lucky to cheat death once. Brian Carson did it twice. The first incident was in Dodge City, Kansas. Carson was going to jump a car 120 feet over 2 tractor trailers and then land upside down on a row of junk cars. But while the plan looked good on paper, there was a fatal flaw in the execution: the speed. The daredevil wasn't going anywhere near fast enough to perform the stunt, and by the time he realized that, it was too late. Carson was doomed. He violently crashed onto the track and instantly burst into flames. No one thought he'd survive, but seconds later, rescue crews pulled him from the fire with only a fractured arm. Now, this would have been a cue for most people to retire, but Brian Carson was not one of them, because mere weeks later, he showed up in Charlotte to do another big stunt, this time with a splint on his broken arm. And once again, he hopped into the car, ready to do something even more daring. A 250-foot jump over 4 flatbeds, landing upright on junk cars, and then driving over them like a monster truck. It was the most insane stunt of his career, and this time he made sure to go full throttle and hit the ramp perfectly. But despite nailing everything, Carson found himself in deep trouble as his suspension compressed in midair and added the one thing he dreaded most: drag. The world slowed down to a standstill as the stuntman flew through the air, knowing he wasn't going to make the jump. But he wouldn't just hit the ground, he actually struck a fire cannon at the exact moment it ignited, making the car crash and crumple into a mess. The rescue crews spent over 30 minutes frantically trying to cut through the twisted metal and bracing themselves to find a dead body. Instead, they found Carson alive and well, with nothing more than bruises and scratches. He didn't even need a stretcher. He just stood up and walked away. In 2016, millions of viewers watched in horror as a live TV stunt almost turned into a public execution. Stuntman Ryan Stock and his fiancée Amber Lynn were performing a trick during the quarterfinals of America's Got Talent, a trick that left no room for error. Ryan had to swallow a long metal rod with a small target attached to it. But there was a catch. He had to keep it super steady deep in his throat because Amberlynn was going to climb a ladder and shoot a flaming arrow with her bow. The target was mere inches away from Ryan's throat, so even a tiny misjudgment could prove fatal. They knew the risk going into it and were confident they'd pull it off, but they hadn't considered one thing: the nerves of being on stage. As Amberlynn released the string, she knew something was wrong because the spring on her laser sight slipped off the arrow and knocked it off its path. And now it was headed straight for Ryan's neck. Everyone winced as the flaming arrow slammed directly into his neck, burning his skin as he stood there, gasping for air and clutching his neck in front of millions. The judges and the live audience froze, certain that they just witnessed a man's final moments, a live execution. Ryan never went down.
Is everything okay? Are you okay? He's okay!
The arrow had not only missed his windpipe and major arteries by a fraction of an inch, but the notch on the arrow was also broken, which reduced its power. A mistake like that should have been fatal, but Ryan walked away with only a minor burn and a scratch. It was a miracle, one that left Ryan Stock as the man who looked death in the eye on live TV and somehow lived through it. Level 2. Stuntman Ray Bowman called this car the Coffin, and in 1993, he nearly made it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Bowman was going for a world record type jump at the Kalgoorlie Boulder airstrip, and the weapon of choice was the Coffin, his iconic XB coupe with Raise Hell written on it. The stunt was simple. He had to hit the ramp and clear a stack of junk cars, but to do that, he needed to be going at least 125 miles per hour.
Now he's ready. Ray floors it, hitting the ramp at 125 miles an hour.
He even had nitrous oxide for some extra boost, which he hit as soon as he soared into the air with enough force to bridge the gap. But the laws of physics had other plans. Just like Gerlon's, the front end of Bowman's car was also too heavy and dragged the nose of the car down the moment it left the ramp. The stuntman was no longer flying, he was about to crash, and he could do nothing about it. Months of prep went out the window just like that, as the muscle car spun in the air and slammed directly into the junk cars. The impact was so violent that it ripped his car in two the second he made impact. But it didn't stop there. As the front half of the car stopped dead in a cloud of debris, the back half, with the man still strapped in, kept rolling down the track. Looking at the wreckage, there was no chance anyone could have survived. Yet, as the dust settled, Bowman was pulled from the coffin alive, having escaped the destruction with nothing more than a broken leg. In 2012, a single patch of loose gravel turned a hill climb race into a 3,000-foot death plunge. Jeremy Foley and his co-pilot, Yuri Kuznetsov, were competing in the famous Pikes Peak hill climb race, some 12,000 feet up in the Colorado mountains. They were seasoned partners, and their car, the iconic Mitsubishi Evo 8, was built for tracks like these. They felt invincible as they sped through corners on the race to the clouds, until they approached the trickiest section of the track, the Devil's Playground. A sharp turn with no rails and a 3,000-foot drop down the mountain. But as Jeremy pushed the car into the corner, he felt something. A patch of loose gravel on the road that made the tires spin and lose grip. This would be their undoing. Spectators watched in horror as the Evo slid towards the edge with no guardrails to catch it, and in an instant, they were airborne. The car flew off the mountain and violently tumbled down, leaving chunks of metal behind it, and because of the speed they were carrying, it rolled over 10 times, getting shredded by the rocks like it had been put through a meat grinder. It finally stopped hundreds of feet below, but the sight was not one for the faint-hearted. The Evo was gone, turned into a mangled mess. But as the dust settled, people witnessed a miracle emerging from the wreckage. Yuri climbed out with a dislocated shoulder, while Foley, with no broken bones, managed to wave to the petrified crowd above. The roll cage was intact, and the two men had just survived a fall from the Devil's Playground. A fall that, by every law of nature, should have spelled their doom. Daredevil stuntman Robbie Knievel spent his life trying to escape his father's shadow, but on May 20th, 1999, he went too far. Robbie was at the Grand Canyon to jump a 228-foot gorge on his trail bike, something that his father, Evel Knievel, never managed. Many thought that he was crazy for even attempting something like that, but this was Robbie's moment. The mile-deep drop didn't scare him. He was about to become a legend, so he revved his bike and sped up to 90 miles per hour, ready to hit the ramp and fly. And fly he did, covering the distance with ease and slamming his tires onto the landing ramp. This was the triumph he'd been waiting for, but the victory was short-lived, because while he'd done the hard part, the thing that awaited him was something that he hadn't anticipated, a dusty runoff area. He fought the bike to gain any bit of traction, but it just wouldn't cooperate. And within seconds, Robbie went from being on the top of the world to hurtling towards disaster. The next thing you knew, the bike had slid out from under him, and he was violently launched to the ground, slamming into the hay bale barrier at breakneck speed. The impact was brutal, and no one expected Robbie to be conscious. Yet, in a display of pure adrenaline, he didn't only stand up, but actually waved to the cheering crowd, only to collapse seconds later. The stuntman broke 3 of his ribs, but as he was being airlifted out of the canyon in critical condition, there was only one thing going through his mind. He'd conquer the gap that broke his father. Spanish illusionist Pedro Volta was dead for 4 minutes after a botched underwater stunt, but only a year later, he was back to prove that he could survive it. The first stunt was in Madrid in 2018. Volta kneeled before the crowd, bound in a straitjacket and locked inside a glass tank full of water. The stunt was simple. He had 2 minutes to escape this death trap, but something was off from the start. He just could not break free from the shackles, and with his oxygen rapidly running out, he only had seconds to get rid of the jacket and open the locks. The stunt was too much for Volta. His body went into violent convulsions before falling still. The crowd thought they'd just seen a man die in front of them. And the truth was, Volta's heart did stop. He was clinically dead for 4 minutes before paramedics shocked him back to life and rushed him to the hospital. Most men would never look at a tank of water again after a harrowing experience like that. But Volta was different. He decided to do it again on national television. So in 2019, he went on Spain's Got Talent to perform the exact stunt, desperate to restore his reputation. He was risking his life again, but most people thought that he'd pull it off on his second attempt. They were wrong. History was about to repeat itself.
Intentando abrir el segundo candado.
While Volta did shed the straitjacket, he ran out of air on the final padlock, and once again his limbs began to twitch and seize as his brain starved for oxygen, except that this time he didn't fall still. But in a final act of survival, Volta jammed his head through a tiny gap in the lid and gasped for air while paramedics stormed the stage. This single act somehow dragged him back from the brink of a second, and this time, final death. The stunts so far have been pretty brutal, but now, things are about to get life-threatening. So hit that subscribe button and let's dive in. Level 3. BMX legend Adam Shreve thought that he was doing a simple jump, but a split-second decision turned a calculated jump into a 30-foot fall on solid concrete. Shreve was shooting a music video in the Mojave Desert, and the stunt wasn't anything he hadn't done before. He just had to launch his bicycle over a gap of 8 cars and a boat. Everything about the stunt was calculated to a T. The angle, the speed, it could not go wrong, especially with Shreve overseeing it. But when his heavy-duty stunt bike was damaged, he was forced to use a much lighter racing model. Shreve hit the takeoff ramp with the speed meant for the heavier bike, and things went south as soon as he was airborne. The lighter bike over-rotated and overshot the landing ramp entirely. This was a point of no return for Shreve. He could either crash with the bike or bail, and staying on the bike would be catastrophic. So 30 feet in the air, Shreve let go of the handles and bailed out, hitting the ground feet first. The force of the impact was so intense that it traveled through his body like a shockwave, snapping his spine in 8 separate places. And as he lay on the ground with a fractured leg and a shattered spine, he thought he'd never walk again. Yet, after surgery and months of grueling recovery, Shreve defied all odds and didn't just walk again, he returned to the world of stunts. In 1992, Bill Shirk tried to honor a dead magician by performing a buried alive stunt, but little did he know that he was stepping into his own grave. Shirk was supposed to climb into a clear plexiglass coffin and be buried under 7 tons of wet dirt and quick-drying cement, an act that he thought was a tribute to Harry Houdini. The coffin was designed to let cameras film him from the inside, but there was one fatal flaw in its construction that became evident as soon as they poured heavy sludge over him. The engineers had severely underestimated the weight of the cement mixture. Within moments of the final pour, the coffin's lid began to groan. And then came the sound that no buried man ever wants to hear, the violent crack of structural failure. The coffin was cracking, and the ceiling was caving in, threatening to flatten Shirk before he could even begin his escape. Panic ensued as the safety crew desperately dug through the hardening concrete, using bare hands and heavy machinery. After all, Shirk was a dead man if they weren't quick enough, but after several minutes of digging, they finally shattered the lid and dragged his unconscious body from the pit. Shirk was rushed to the hospital and survived. But the most chilling part of the story isn't the rescue, because 2 years earlier, another stuntman, Joe Burris, had attempted the exact feat, except that he wasn't pulled out in time and his coffin collapsed. Shirk followed a dead man's footsteps to the very edge of the grave and somehow climbed back out. When acrobats climbed up on the hanging structure, a single carabiner was all that stood between an incredible circus act and a massacre. The Ringling Bros and the Barnum and Bailey Circus was in the middle of their famous high-flying human chandelier performance. In 2014, 8 female acrobats were suspended 40 feet in the air, hanging by nothing but their own hair on a massive metal frame. The crowd was awestruck by the display of strength and balance until a disaster struck. The wait was not safe. Seconds after the curtains were dropped, the steel clip holding the entire structure snapped, and there were no nets or wires to stop them. Thus, the heavy metal structure plummeted instantly, crashing into the arena floor with all 8 women attached. They slammed into the ground with the 160-kilogram chandelier falling on top of them, also crushing a 9th performer standing directly under them. Screams pierced through the arena as the crowd thought they'd seen a massacre. But despite the 40-foot freefall, every single performer survived. The miracle didn't come without cost though. Most of them couldn't feel their legs after the fall and suffered life-altering injuries, including shattered legs, broken backs, and fractured necks. It was a brutal reminder that sometimes the line between a standing ovation and a tragedy is slimmer than you think. In 2007, skateboarder Jake Brown launched himself into the air for a world record, but instead, he fell 4 stories onto a flat wooden floor. Brown was on fire during the 2007 X Games, doing flawless tricks on the mega ramp all day. But too many perfect runs in quick succession perhaps made him too confident, and that would be his downfall. Brown was screaming towards the final quarter pipe after doing an incredible 720 across the massive 70-foot gap, but he didn't think about the transition. He was too fast on the entry, and by the time he realized what had happened, he was already 45 feet up in the air. Even worse, he got pushed away from the pipe and lost his skateboard midair, meaning he wasn't gonna make the landing either. He bypassed the landing slope entirely on his way down, flailing his arms and slamming directly onto the flat, hardwood floor. The impact was so violent that he didn't even react to it. He just lay there as if there was no life left in him. But Brown was alive. He suffered a fractured wrist, a lacerated liver and lung, cracked vertebrae, and a concussion. Despite all that, he eventually got up and walked off the ramp.
I can't wait to come back. I want all these guys to come and check it out next year.
But even more importantly, he returned 1 year later to the very same ramp at X Games 14 and walked away with the gold medal. Sometimes a gust of wind is enough to turn a world record attempt into a 245-foot overshoot that crushed a man's skull. In 1999, stuntman Seth Enslow was in Apple Valley, California, trying to break the world record at 250 feet. Enslow was confident. He had a custom Honda bike that was built for the job. But there was one small issue: the crosswinds. The man had already canceled the jump the day before due to dangerous desert winds, and maybe he should have called off the entire thing, but he didn't. Enslow went ahead with the jumps anyway, ignoring the warning signs. His entry onto the ramp looked good. He was going quickly and it looked like he'd made the 245-foot jump. But that's when the tailwind kicked in. The strong gusts caught him midair, pushing him far past his calculated trajectory, so much so that he overshot the landing ramp entirely, and now he was headed straight towards the flat desert floor. Enslow slammed into the ground with such force that it whipped his head forward and drove his face directly into the steel handlebars of the bike. And even though he was wearing a helmet, the impact instantly crushed the frontal bone of his skull right above his right eye. The stuntman got airlifted to the hospital, and to save him, surgeons had to peel back his scalp from ear to ear and reconstruct his shattered forehead with titanium plates. Most people would never sit on a bike again, but Enslow made a full recovery and went right back to jumping. Level 4. Trying to make a car fly by strapping a rocket engine on it sounds like a death wish, but in 1976, a man did it anyway and paid the price. The stunt was crazy, even by the daredevil Spanky Spangler's own standards. But he was hell-bent on making it happen. He had all the bits he needed: a car, a rocket engine, and a lake. He was about to jump over. His plan was to jump into the water using raw thrust, hitting the ramp at over 100 miles per hour. He didn't need a long run-up or practice. The man truly believed that he could make this car fly like a plane. But he forgot about one crucial detail. The car was shaped like a brick. So the moment he left the ramp, the air started working against him. Wind hit the car like a truck, slowing it down to a crawl midair. And with zero aerodynamic ability, the car was just a hunk of metal thrown off the edge of the lake. The next thing Spangler knew, he was headed straight for the water with no way out. The car slammed into the water at full force, snapping his back and knocking him out unconscious instantly. But that was not even the worst part. The impact dislodged Spangler's breathing equipment, meaning he couldn't breathe underwater.
I'm underwater. I have no oxygen. It's dark. I can see about this much light out of one door. I'm upside down, so I got everything going against me.
He was strapped in a metal tomb underwater, drowning in the dark while the crowd watched. It was only the quick reaction of the rescue divers that saved his life, as they pulled him from the cockpit before his lungs filled with water. Spangler survived, but he learned the hard way that 4,000 pounds of American steel was never meant to fly. In 1979, a $1 million rocket car stunt ended in a pile of floating scrap and 4 years of work down the drain. Stuntman Kenny Powers strapped himself into a Lincoln Continental fitted with wings and a rocket engine. The goal? Jump 1 mile from Ontario into New York, crossing the entirety of the St. Lawrence River. Even the idea seemed utterly insane. But the thing is, Powers wasn't even supposed to be there. He was a last-minute replacement for the original stuntman, Ken Carter, whom the investors feared had lost his nerve. Carter knew the machine was a death trap. They didn't listen. They'd poured too much into it. $1 million and 4 years of planning. There was no going back. As soon as Powers hit the pedal, he knew that the stunt was doomed. The uneven gravel made the ride vibrate into oblivion, and the shaking was so bad that the car started shedding parts before it even left the ground. This was still not enough to make him stop though. He thought he'd make it even if he landed in a hunk of scrap. So he pushed on, blasting down the 1,400-foot runway and speeding up the ramp. But just as he reached the tip, the parachutes opened up and instantly killed his momentum. The Lincoln was never meant to fly. The car floated down into the river, landing 4,500 feet short of the target. But the initial jerk was costly. Powers was slammed against the dashboard with enough force to break his back. When divers pulled his broken body from the sinking wreckage, he looked up with a hopeful expression and asked if he'd made it. He hadn't. Powers survived the impact, but the $1 million dream was at the bottom of the river. Rehearsal for a TV stunt turned into a gruesome collision as a slight error turned into a lifelong regret. Stuntman Jonathan Goodwin was on the set of America's Got Talent Extreme in 2021, preparing for one of the most dangerous stunts he'd ever done. Goodwin was supposed to be suspended 30 feet in the air, bound in a straitjacket, and dangled directly between two heavy cars swinging towards him like a giant pendulum. The plan was a split-second escape, free himself from the jacket, and drop to a safety mat before the vehicles come together. It looked simple on paper, but they needed the cars to move with a perfectly calculated speed and timing. Even a slight miscalculation could have proved fatal, and sadly, that's exactly what happened. The timing for the cars wasn't just off, it was deadly. They swung inward with more speed than anyone anticipated, crushing Goodwin between them like a sandwich. But that was just the beginning of his anguish, because the impact was so strong that it triggered a massive fireball, engulfing Goodwin, who, by the way, was still trapped. The man had zero luck that day, so much so that when he did fall 30 feet to the ground, he missed the safety airbag entirely, slamming headfirst into the hard floor. The crew didn't even know how to react. They were convinced they just witnessed a live execution. But Goodwin survived the impact, although the cost of his life was his body. He broke his back, got burned badly, and lost his kidney. The accident left him paralyzed from the waist down, forced to use a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Gary Wells went to Las Vegas to conquer the jump that nearly killed the legendary daredevil Evel Knievel, but he had no idea he was about to become another victim of that stunt. The 23-year-old stuntman lined up his motorcycle near the famous Caesar's Palace fountains on September 15, 1980, almost 13 years after Knievel was crushed by the same jump. Wells was confident. He knew what had to be done to clear the 150-foot gap of water and neon that had become a graveyard for daredevils. But there's a difference between planning and execution, and that would be Wells' downfall. He had the perfect entry into the ramp, carrying enough speed and soaring through the air over the fountains. But as he reached the apex of his jump, the bike began to drift to the right. And as the front end dipped, Wells realized that he wasn't going to hit the narrow landing ramp. He was on a collision course and he could do nothing about it. Even hitting the ground wouldn't have been the end of the world though. But Wells was on a streak of bad luck with this jump because as he landed, his rear wheel clipped the safety barrier, sending him straight into the parking lot pavement at over 80 miles per hour. The impact was so devastating that it threw Wells like a ragdoll into a signpost. And he didn't just break bones, his entire body was destroyed. But he wasn't the only victim. Because of the impact, another retaining wall near the entrance to an underground garage collapsed, injuring 6 other people. Wells was rushed to the hospital in a coma, where he stayed in limbo between life and death for 3 weeks. He may have conquered the fountain, but the concrete lot proved that at Caesar's Palace, the house always wins. Disaster struck when a last-minute change turned an illegal thrill ride into a 200-foot plunge. In 1997, daredevil Steve Trotter led a group of 5 jumpers to the Sunshine Skyway Bridge in Tampa, Florida. The goal? Perform a human pendulum stunt, dropping down in unison and swinging under the bridge. But there was one problem. The stunt was illegal. Trotter and his group had no permits or official permission, so they had to set up quickly, do the stunt, and then escape before authorities arrived. This was not the only problem though, because as they parked their limo and stood on the edge, one participant lost his nerve and backed out. But the stunt had to be done. And with time running out, a teenager with no experience stepped in. The whole thing was a recipe for disaster from the get-go, and it was clear that they were diving into a catastrophe. And to add the final nail in the coffin, the tension on the cables was never properly calculated. They didn't account for G-force. So as the 5 jumpers leapt off the bridge, their combined weight of 1,000 pounds hit the line with a force that it couldn't handle. Within seconds, the cable snapped and sent all 5 people into a freefall towards the water. They'd messed up and now it was too late to go back. The group slammed into the bay from 70 feet up with a force that must have felt like hitting concrete. The scene in the water was tragic. One jumper was floating unconscious with a broken back, while another had stopped breathing, his spine shattered by the impact. As the survivors scrambled to keep their friends' heads above the water, the situation quickly turned into a $70,000 rescue operation and a wave of arrests at the hospital. Steve Trotter and his crew had come for a rush of adrenaline, but they left with life-changing injuries and shattered relationships. Level 5. In 2014, Rakesh's attempt to impress his friends turned a pile of laundry into a hazard. Rakesh Garcia sold blankets in India for a living, but on the morning of December 13th, he thought it'd be fun to entertain his friends and do somersaults over piles of blankets outside his home. He cleared the first jump easily, but then hubris started brewing. He started adding more clothes to the pile to really push the limit, and this time he took a longer running start. Rakesh thought that he was jumping for a laugh, but the reality was, he was jumping into a grave. As he launched into the air, Rakesh under-rotated, which meant that instead of landing on his feet, he fell headfirst into the makeshift padding. But it wasn't the impact that got him. Instead, it was the weight of his body that drove his skull into the ground at an awkward angle and instantly snapped his neck. Rakesh didn't move after that. The haunting CCTV footage showed his friends standing around him, confused. They had no idea that their friend had just been paralyzed and that every second without medical care was sealing his fate. Rakesh was eventually rushed to the hospital, but the damage to his spine was too much. After 6 days of fighting for his life, Rakesh succumbed to his injuries. It was a staggering reminder that you don't need a crazy stunt to meet a tragic end. Sometimes, all it takes is one wrong step in your own front yard. Stuntman Salyendra Natharoy spent his whole life proving that his hair was stronger than steel. But on a zipline over the Teesta River, he discovered the limit of the human body. Roy was a police officer by trade, but he was famous in India for pulling literal trains and trucks using his ponytail. But on April 28, 2013, he decided to take his talents to another level. He wanted to cross the Teesta River while suspended 70 feet in the air, attached to a zip line only by his hair. The man had pulled trains, so his own body weight seemed like child's play in this situation. Confident, he didn't do any prep before the stunt and just wore a life jacket for the water below. He didn't even have a safety line for the wire above. But halfway through, his ponytail got stuck in the wheel of rope, leaving Roy dangling helplessly over the center of the river. He had no backup plan for this, and as the minutes ticked by, the weight of his own body began to tear at his scalp. Roy fought frantically, trying to reach up and grab the wire with his hands and alleviate the pressure, but he was trapped. For 20 minutes, the crowd watched in awe as Roy struggled against the pain and the height. Sadly for him, while the hair might have been strong enough to hold his weight, the extreme physical and psychological stress was more than his body could endure. Roy suffered a heart attack mid-air, and his body went limp, swinging silently over the water as life left him. By the time the rescuers reached him, it was too late. He was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. Roy had conquered the strength of the machines, only to be defeated by the frailty of his own heart. Franz Reichelt believed he'd invented a way to conquer the sky, but February 4th, 1912 proved him wrong. Known as the Flying Tailor, Reichelt was a man obsessed. He spent hours designing and sewing a massive parachute made of rubber and silk to save the lives of early pilots. But there was a problem. Every time he dropped a mannequin wearing the suit from his apartment, it slammed into the pavement. Reichelt ignored the failures, choosing to believe that the suit just needed more height to breathe. So he spent a year begging the police for access to the Eiffel Tower to run a trial from a better height. They eventually granted him permission, but only under the strict condition that he use a dummy for the test. When Reichelt arrived that freezing morning, he dropped the act. Standing before a crowd of journalists and rolling film cameras, he declared that he was the one taking the lead. His friends pleaded with him to stop, pointing to the suit's track record of failure. But Reichelt didn't listen. He was confident in his mastery. Determined to take the leap of faith, Reichelt stepped onto a chair placed on a table to clear the guardrail and stared 187 feet down at the frozen ground. After a long, harrowing moment of hesitation, he jumped. The suit never stood a chance. Instead of opening into a canopy, the silk fold simply tangled around his limbs, pinning his arms to his sides. He didn't float, he plummeted like a rock tied to a feather. In less than 3 seconds, the Flying Tailor struck the ground with such velocity that it left a dent in the ground as a symbol of his failure. He died instantly, his skull and spine shattered by the very invention that he thought would change the world. A veteran stuntman's final performance turned into a crime scene when a controlled rollover went horribly wrong. SM Raju was on the set of the film Vol.2 on July 13, 2025. He was a professional known for perfectly executing any stunt you throw at him. It was a high-stakes sequence where he'd drive an SUV onto a ramp and force it to flip and roll for the cameras. Raju was not worried at all. He was the master of stunts like these. But little did he know, the car was not built for the stunt. Raju hit the ramp at high speed, launching the SUV into its planned rotation. But as the multi-ton vehicle slammed into the ground, the impact was more violent than the frame could handle. As the cameras rolled and the team looked on in horror, the roof structure of the SUV collapsed, and Raju was devoured by the twisted metal. The vehicle didn't just roll out of control, it imploded within its own weight. Raju was trapped inside the cabin as the metal gave way, causing catastrophic blunt force trauma and crushing injuries. The crew members rushed to the wreckage, desperately trying to pull the stuntman from the remains of the car. But it was too little, too late, and Raju was gone. He was declared dead upon arrival at the hospital. The stuntman had spent his life perfecting the art of the crash, but in the end, he was killed by the one thing a stuntman can never truly account for: the split second where control gives way to consequence. Level 6. In 2017, a simple equipment swap turned a glowing concert stage into a platform for execution. On July 7th, the Mad Cool Music Festival in Madrid was in full swing. Acrobat Pedro Añón Monroy was suspended inside a box high above the main stage, preparing for an incredible bungee transition between sets. The stunt required him to detach his short safety line and clip into a long elastic cord before diving into the void. It was a routine maneuver for a professional, but in the darkness and adrenaline of the festival, a single connection spelt his doom. The cord was not locked. Unaware that he was no longer tethered to anything, Pedro dove out of the box. He expected the familiar tug of the elastic to snap him back towards the top, but instead, he met the unbroken pull of gravity. Pedro plummeted to his death, a 100-foot drop in front of the oblivious onlookers, before slamming into the ground directly in front of the massive crowd waiting for Green Day to take the stage. As the crowd registered what had just happened, the music was replaced by a collective scream of horror. Medical teams swarmed the scene, but there was no recovery from a 100-foot fall onto solid ground. Pedro died where he landed, his final performance ending in a tragedy that played out in front of tens of thousands. The festival continued, but for those who saw the fall, the glowing box in the sky became a horrific reminder of the instant a safety line betrayed its purpose and became an instrument of death. Stuntman Todd Green cheated death while wing walking once, but when he returned the next day to repeat a stunt, his luck ran out. Green, who was the king of wing walking, was performing at the Selfridge Air Show in Michigan in 2011, doing a stunt that was much more dangerous than anything he'd done. Because this time, he wasn't only walking on the wing of a plane, he also had to transfer himself to a helicopter mid-air without a safety harness, parachute, or a safety net below to catch him. This was, by all means, a true test of nerves. Thousands watched from below as Green perched on the top wing of the plane and tried to grab the landing skid of the helicopter flying next to him.
How about you?
Nope. It took him 5 attempts to successfully grab the helicopter and hang on. He'd done it. The stunt was complete, and Todd Green was a legend. But then he decided to do it again the next day, and that's where he sealed his fate. The stunt started the same way as it did previously, but this time the margin of error had vanished. Green reached out for the steel skid of the helicopter, but his fingers failed to find a secure hold. And this time, he didn't get to attempt it 4 times. His fingers slipped off the skid, and he was now in freefall. 75,000 spectators watched in collective shock as Green slipped backwards off the wing and fell 150 feet. landing with a sickening thud. Green sustained fatal blunt force trauma from the impact and died before reaching the hospital. He'd spent his career dancing on the wings of airplanes, but on that afternoon, the sky finally let go. Paul Mance was the king of Hollywood stunt pilots, but on July 8, 1965, he strapped up into a machine that was never meant to fly. Mance was filming The Flight of the Phoenix in the Arizona desert, but he wasn't even supposed to be on the set. He was only filling in for his partner, who had been sidelined in a freak go-kart accident at home. Mance knew the business like the back of his palm, but there was a slight caveat. Mance used to plan most of his stunts, but since he was a replacement, he wasn't involved in the planning at all, and the plane he was piloting was perhaps even worse. The Tallman's Phoenix P-1, a cobbled-together monstrosity built from spare parts to look like scrap metal. The P-1 was nose-heavy, had no flaps, and was structurally heavy. It was a machine made for the cameras, not for safety. But Mance didn't mind. After all, he just had to do a simple touch-and-go maneuver, landing on the sand for only a split second before taking off again. So he strapped in and absolutely nailed the first attempt. Yet his job wasn't done. He'd slightly overshot the camera during landing, which in most cases would have been good enough for the movie, but the director insisted on another pass as insurance. The second take would be the final moment of Mance's life. As he was skimming the desert floor at 90 miles per hour, the landing gear hit an uneven patch of sand. Mance slammed the throttle to break free, and for a moment, it looked like he might actually fly off. But the initial impact had already done its damage. The makeshift frame of the plane snapped apart, and for a moment, the two crew members were hanging outside of the cockpit. The co-pilot, Bobby Rose, was thrown out, but Mance got pinned down by the wings and died on the spot. The most haunting detail about the incident, however, is that the stuntman could have lived had he worn his crash helmet, but at the last second, he chose to ditch it for the soft-brimmed hat that actor James Stewart wore in the film. In the end, the king of Hollywood pilots died the way he lived, flying for the cameras. A stunning performance at the Dayton Air Show turned into a disaster when the plane stalled close to the ground. On June 22, 2013, Jane Wicker and her pilot, Charlie Schwenker, were the star attraction. They were performing their signature high-stakes stunt.
Now she's still on that far side. Keep an eye on Jane. Keep an eye on Charlie. Watch this. Jane Wicker sitting on top of the world.
Schwenker would roll the biplane upside down while Wicker sat on the bottom wing, dangling upside down and waving to the thousands of spectators below. For a few moments, the scene looked unreal as the whole crowd cheered. They were a perfect pairing, and it seemed like nothing could go wrong. Until it did. As the plane flew low over the runway, the nose began to tip, and the wings tilted sideways. Schwenker knew they were in trouble, so he fought with the controls to pull the aircraft out of the descent, but they were flying too slow and too close to the ground to recover. The next few moments were a blur as the left wingtip caught the grass and instantly sent the biplane into a violent cartwheel at 150 miles per hour. The impact was devastating as the plane erupted into a fireball the moment it struck the dirt, killing both Wicker and Schwenker instantly. And just like that, the vibrant biplane with Wicker doing her elegant moves was transformed into a black plume of smoke. Level 7. A monster truck exhibition in Mexico went south when a 5-ton machine transformed into a wrecking ball aimed directly at the front row. In 2013, thousands of families gathered in a dry riverbed for the Extreme Air Show in Chihuahua. The main attraction? A monster truck called Big Show, driven by Francisco Velázquez. The routine was something he'd done a million times before. The truck would launch over a line of junk cars and crush them for the crowd. But when the giant truck drove over 2 cars at high speed, the landing wasn't perfect. The massive tires hit the ground too hard, and just like that, The spectacle turned into a slaughter. The truck bounced violently upon landing, and Velasquez lost all control. So rather than slowing down, the big show surged forward, swerving away from the track and directly toward the spectators. But here's the tragedy. The venue didn't have any concrete barriers or fences. There was nothing but open air between the families and the massive monster truck. The crowd tried to disperse, but the truck was too fast, rolling directly over spectators in the front row. The incident killed 8 people and left 80 others with severe injuries. And Velasquez, turns out he didn't just lose control, he actually had alcohol in his system. But eyewitnesses say that he hit his head on the steering wheel and got incapacitated. Regardless, the incident remains, to this day, the deadliest monster truck accident in history. In 1988, a miscalculation by a single pilot turned a symbol of love into a firestorm. The Italian Frecce Tricolori display team was performing at Ramstein Air Base in West Germany. They were executing their signature Pierce Heart maneuver. 2 groups of jets fly in a heart-shaped formation while the soloist, Ivo Nutarelli, dives through the center to pierce it. It was meant to be the show's breathtaking finale, but as the jets closed in at the intersection, the timing was totally flawed. Nutarelli arrived at the crossing point too fast and too slow, and by the time he realized his error, it was too late. At an altitude of only 150 feet, his jet slammed into the lead plane and another wingman. The solo aircraft disintegrated instantly, and its burning frame, now acting like a missile, shot forward. It skipped over the tarmac, cartwheeled through a barbed wire fence, and exploded directly into a dense crowd of families gathered around an ice cream van. Screams of horror soon followed. The airfield was instantly transformed into a war zone. The initial fireball and a rain of burning jet fuel caused catastrophic thermal trauma, killing 67 spectators and all 3 pilots involved. And nearly 1,500 others were left with horrific injuries as the shrapnel field tore through the crowd. The disaster rewrote airshow safety in blood, forever ending the practice of directing high-speed maneuvers toward the crowd. All of these disasters were driven by a rush of adrenaline. But what happens when everything is risked for likes? Find out in our video on trends ending in disaster.